Well, good afternoon. Hi, my name is Edie Shapolsky, and I am co presenting with Dr. Samuel Zelanga, and I'm so grateful that he is there with you, and my deep regrets that I'm not able to join. My 92-year-old mother took ill out in Vancouver Island about a week ago, and I've been able to travel out here to be with her, and I'm very happy to report that the doctors really can't explain it, but she is doing so much better. So I'm so grateful. And I'm grateful that I'm able to join you today through this little quick time presentation that I'm making. I've never done this before, so I hope it works well. And thank you in advance for your patience with this. So, by way of brief introduction, I mentioned my name is Edie. I'm the chair of the social work department at Bethel University. I have been there, this is my fifth year, and absolutely am loving the work. And I did social work practice for about 20 years previous to coming or prior to coming to Bethel. So I'm grateful to be with you today, and I'm going to try to pick up from where Dr. Zelanga left off, if I can get this to work properly. And I want to talk now a little bit about the impact of neoliberalism for social work and focus for a few slides on the concept of precarization or precarity. And the first thing I want to talk about is expanding precarity for the individual under a neoliberal state, or within the context of neoliberalism. So we do see, after you sort of think through those elements that Samuel talked about, but we see that there's expanding precarity for the individual, increasing vulnerability for at-risk individuals, for at-risk families and communities. Because citizens under the neoliberal state are increasingly ignored, and that's in lieu of advancing global competitiveness. Those who are marginalized are really, truly, increasingly at risk. So I want to think now a little bit beyond the individual and think about the impacts of neoliberalism and the expanding precarity for social support systems. The rise of neoliberalism corresponds with the related inherent suspicion that has been cultivated around the social safety net and any programs which advance the common good. So we see in this neoliberal context that individuals are more at risk, and then the social support systems that are in place to support those families and communities and individuals are also increasingly at risk. Let's talk for a moment here. We're still talking about precarity, but let's talk about the generalization of precarity as a shared condition. Neoliberalism works to distribute insecurity and risk across the entire social system. So everyone now is subject to precarity. So the example that I have written up here for middle and upper class folks lucky enough to have a familial and social safety net and social capital, precarity might figure primarily as a steady stream of anxiety and uncertainty about the future. Now, certainly we have seen just significantly higher levels of anxiety. I'm going to talk about that again in a few minutes across all systems. But we see for the poor working class, people who do not have access to privatized social protection like inherited wealth, precarity figures more prominently as a deeply material and economic threat that they have to confront day in and day out. So when we think about those levels of protection that Samuel referenced in his presentation, we see that for those that have social safety nets, they still are vulnerable to precarity because they are going to experience it more anxiety and uncertainty about the future, but they still have that safety net there. But for the poor working class, things are becoming more complex and difficult. Let's shift for a minute now and talk about the normalization of crisis. This is where crisis becomes ordinary, or we can use the term crisis ordinariness. And we, I think, are all very aware that that's happening. In a privatized global society, which is fueled by crisis and is characterized by extreme violence, both at home and abroad. And we think about secret drone strikes, the crisis in the Middle East. We see on a global level militarized police forces who are increasingly empowered to turn on communities and citizens, which is pretty terrifying. More than ever before, individuals, families, and communities we serve are impacted by extreme violence and trauma, influenced significantly by the rise of neoliberalism. Violence, really, both global and everyday, occurs to all of us increasingly as unexceptional, which is really something I think we need to think about. Folks are living on the brink, they're traumatized by life itself, and it's becoming much more ordinary and an accepted way of life, which I don't think is what God intended for His creation. A next consideration, I think this is really important as we think about being social workers or administrators or supervisors or executive directors, or if we are working for a government system. But we need to understand the role of neoliberalism and how the state changes in that kind of system. Under the neoliberal state, the role of the state morphs into that of protector of corporations and free markets rather than the protector of society, which includes marginalized individuals, families, and communities. And those folks, again, are made more vulnerable. When the corporations are protected rather than people, we see a rise in sort of comprehensive system-wide dehumanization, and we see that people begin to only have value as human capital, and Samuel referenced that in his portion of the presentation. The state as protector of corporations coincides with the emergence of the concept of corporate personhood. So now we see that corporations are getting rights. And because there's so much money and power, often the rights of the corporation supersede the rights of the individuals. And all this can happen really insidiously, not necessarily so, but insidious insofar as we are oftentimes not really aware of it because it's sort of that generalized sort of just the way things are. I'll talk about that again in a minute. And I think we also can look at the example of Citizens United and that decision as a good example of this. As social workers, we always want to think of care of self for ourselves and for our families, and then we also often encourage the people with whom we work to take care of themselves and to incorporate self-care in various ways. We have to understand that neoliberalism also impacts self-care. When we live in constant competition, that breeds social alienation and disconnection at both the individual and the societal levels. When we live within the context of a neoliberal culture that commands us to be constantly producing and performing, that is at the cost of giving up self-care practices because we are driven to something different than that, to produce and to perform, which invariably leads to increasing levels of anxiety. These increased levels of anxiety, we can see that that's evident across social systems, and often for the people that we serve and with whom we work, it's a result of the dismantling of the welfare state. Within the context of increasing competition, programs are defunded, and the kinds of things that we fund and drive money or put money is allocated towards is not really to support people who are falling through the safety nets. So again, Samuel talked about the levels of protection, and here, people are increasingly finding themselves on their own without anything to fall back on. I want to talk a little bit more. As I said, I teach, and this data is so relevant for the classroom and for students, but I think it's a good sort of snapshot of any sort of subsection we might look at. So the increasing levels of anxiety and depression that are evident in the classroom, linked to increasing precarity, again, that concept of precarity coming up for individuals and families, and the pressure to perform and produce. So this data that was collected showed that 64% of young adults who are no longer in college are not attending college because of a mental health condition. 25% of college students have been diagnosed with a mental health condition. 72% of students living with a mental health condition have experienced a mental health crisis on campus. 31% have felt so depressed that it was difficult to function. That's a huge number. 50% have felt overwhelming anxiety, and 45% have felt things were helpless. Again, I submit to you that this is inextricably intertwined with the rise of neoliberalism and how it impacts individuals, families, communities, society as a whole. So, something that I hope, will begin to think about more. The next thing I want to just talk about for a few minutes is the commodification of social work in the context of neoliberalism. So social work as a commodity. So I don't think we often think about that. Some of us do, some of us don't. The commodification of social work represents a profound misunderstanding of the nature of knowledge, marginalizing the role of education in facilitating the development of citizens who are capable of critical thought, a precursor for any democratic society. And I include this here because, yes, it's relevant in the context of higher ed, but I think it's also extremely relevant in the context of social work agency practice and policy. So, and the importance of infusing critical thought and critical theory into the work that we do when we lead and when we lead organizations or when we work with families and communities and individuals. Increasingly, social work, the practice of social work is treated as a commodity, which often now is privately owned. And oftentimes within the context of this commodification, the inclusion of critical theory becomes increasingly relevant or unfortunately irrelevant. I have seen many in my state and in the different roles that I've performed before I got into higher ed. I've seen many people become very wealthy by providing social work types of services, which I think is something we need to start to think about. And I also have seen a whole myriad of different. I just lost my train of thought, and I'm not going to start this video over, so I can come back to that part. But I do want to say that when we commodify social work practice, oftentimes human dignity and worth is lost or not placed at the highest level. And as people of faith, I believe that we are really called to recognize that God, all individuals, all human beings are created in the image of God, and we should ascribe to all individuals human worth and dignity, and that sometimes inherent in the system that is lost. And yes, I can't get it back. I was trying to. So I want to say social work practice absent of any critical anti-racist, pro-feminist discourse does really risk creating practitioner services who conform to dominant discourses. And sometimes we're not even aware that there might be some elements of injustice or corruption within those, and oftentimes align themselves with mainstream neoliberalism. So I think we really need to be thoughtful and be critical, apply critical thinking and theory to the work that we do. I thought it was very interesting also to look at the different kinds of works that social workers do and see that large numbers of, we have practitioners that are doing children, family, school, social work, healthcare, mental health, those kinds of things. But this data that I pulled is largely absent. The numbers are largely absent of people who are doing policy work, and I think it is so critical for us to think about the systemic approaches and ecosystems and how different things are impacting the people who are marginalized and fall outside of the system so often. And we also, I think, can be accountable to create policies within our own agencies that we can ensure uphold the human dignity and worth of all people. Paulo Freire expressed that social workers have to be more than moral agents, and that our attempts to be neutral results in the propagation of oppressive hegemonic systems. I think that is a really powerful statement. And oftentimes we find ourselves in positions where neutrality seems to be the path of least resistance. And sometimes when we are neutral, we can propagate that oppression. And it's always my prayer that I can be open to seeing when that is occurring. As social workers, I believe we must concern ourselves with understanding and addressing the impacts of neoliberalism that we've been discussing, to critically examine our practice and our systems to assess whether the tenets of neoliberalism and globalization have limited our objectives to be compliant with the dominant discourses rather than critically reflective, transformative learning and practice. I think the implications for social work education and practice, we have to continue to seek to recognize the perpetuation and promotion of establishment social work approaches that accept the status quo and promote instead focus on critical forms of social work that critique the dominant social structures and power relationships or relations which cause broad social divisions. Um, and then I kind of will jump down to the bottom one. Critical theory is about human liberation and emancipation. It is not just making suffering sufferable. And I think that's kind of the rub. Sometimes and I've been a part of systems and programs that aren't successful, and sometimes we are just making suffering sufferable. And I think it's really important to step outside of that and understand that policy is so important, and we have to critically engage with how we're doing things, always be informed of best practices, and look at the big ecosystems perspective in order to make sure that we're always on the cutting edge of challenging the status quo and providing services that are really about changing lives. Okay, a couple more things. Many years ago, when I was doing my undergraduate degree in English literature, I remember studying Martin Buber, the philosopher who talked about I, it, and I, thou, and contrasted those two pieces. And I find this to be a really beautiful way that I often teach my students to think about their work. And when we have an I, it view of humanity, the implications are like this. Individuals can become commodified and viewed as human capital. Rights can be violated. There's a demand on them to produce and perform. Corporations have, they are seen as being more valuable and have more rights than human beings. The safety net disappears, and individuals, families, communities are at increasing risk. When we take the I thou view of humanity, and I would submit to you today that that is based strongly on, the imago Dei and us being created in the image of God, it transforms everything. And oftentimes I have seen in the community and working for different agencies and organizations that even within the context of agency, that we get into systems and we sort of have this cookie cutter idea, and that the people who are walking in through our doors are really treated in the I, it versus in the I, thou way that we want to think of things, where human rights and personal dignity are always upheld. It would result in decreasing stress and violence. Funding for programs which enhance well-beings and families would be much more important to us if we valued those kinds of things, if we had a sacred sort of view of human beings, which would result in the invisible being made visible, human suffering decreasing. There's many environmental justice implications about that, which is a completely different presentation. But I do think the act of making visible all those people who suffer and who aren't seen is so critically important. And if we understand every human being and all of God's creation as being sacred, it will transform not only ourselves, but it will transform the work that we do. And I think it's something we have to critically remind ourselves of each and every day. So with that said, I want to thank you so much to listening to this, what I hope was not too boring of a video. I'm still hoping that I can get it uploaded onto YouTube and sent to you. And I hope to have more conversation around this issue maybe next year at NACSW. God bless you all. Thank you to Samuel. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Peace and blessings.